Hey, so here's the problem again. We're going to restate moving to the cloud is very complicated. It's not an easy thing for businesses and law firms to do. And it's not something you just want to throw darts at and hope you hit the mark. Businesses and law firms can't afford to be down. You can't afford problems. And if you don't have the right plan in place to move to the cloud, well, that's all you're going to have. So over the next three more, this one and two more, actually, Dave, two more sessions, we're going to talk about best practices for cloud migration strategies, things that we've employed for us and our customers in the past. And so today, we're going to talk about networks and infrastructures, which includes a lot of different things, and servers and so on and so forth. But before I get started on that, again, welcome to No Law Firm Left Behind. I'm Jim Gass. That guy right there is Dave Myers. Dave, hi.
Howdy.
And Vinny is going to join at some point. I think he's having some technical difficulties. But as soon as he does, what we're going to go into is all of this stuff about cloud migration strategies. But remember, No Law Firm Left Behind is here to help your law firm be more competitive, help your staff and attorneys be more productive, and ultimately to help you get new customers, right? That's what we're here for. And so we want to thank you for joining this and every week. And so Dave, real quick question for you.
Yeah.
Cloud, when it comes to cloud applications, that's an easy one for people because somebody's selling a point solution like a Cosmolex or a QuickBooks Online or something like that. But when you start talking, and email, right, is another easy one, right? But when you start talking about networks and infrastructures and servers, it's a lot bigger onion, if you will. Hi, Vinny, thanks for joining us. It's a lot bigger onion than one would just think. So, maybe you can kind of touch on, you guys both can touch on some of the elements that go into cloud networks and infrastructures.
Yeah. I mean, let's start by talking about what, the onion looks like on infrastructure generally. It's a very vague term when we're, thinking in the world of computing because we're used to working on a computer using, that's the hardware that we're all familiar with. And we're using programs, which is those are the applications that we're used to using, the software. But what most users don't realize is there's a whole lot of other stuff happening behind the scenes. It's to make a comparison, when you wash your hands, you turn on the sink, but you don't really ever stop to think about all the piping and plumbing that's going on behind the scenes that gets that clean water from the water company out to the sink to wash your hands.
Yeah.
When we start talking about infrastructure, it's sort of that same thing. It's, what are all the various conduits by which we're delivering, this, that, or the other application to the end user, whatever, their interface might be with it. And so you have everything from ways to, transmit information to ways to store information, both long-term and short-term. You have issues with regarding on how do we protect and isolate that information to make sure that only the right people can get to it at the right time. How do we change that information from something that I'm working with to getting it to, a printer or into another program or off to another person? That's what I typically, consider the job of infrastructure. It's that piping behind the scenes that allows all the other stuff to take place. And it's very vague as far as a concept goes. And there's a lot of options available when it comes to picking up and taking that infrastructure piece and moving it into the cloud. So it gets even more vague when we say, hey, we're going to take it and we're going to put it in the cloud. And so we really need to look at what all our different options are.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about those options, most of the small business customers that we deal with think of their network as a server, some hard drives maybe. They think of it as maybe a network switch and or a firewall. And just so everyone knows, all that stuff is the same in the cloud, right? I mean, if we as SpliceNet, and Vinny, you can talk, if we buy a server, a physical server to install for someone, which we haven't done in a while, it's kind of interesting. We have to buy all those components, right? don't we have to get all of those same components from a service like an Azure or an Amazon or something like that? And that's just talking about the server. Would you kind of lead into that and the options there, Vinny?
Yeah, so I mean, when you talk about infrastructure on like an Azure, right? You still need virtual switches. You still need hard drives. You're still buying the computing power, the memory. You're still buying the speed, right?
Processors.
You're buying. You can potentially even buy virtual firewalls and all that other stuff.
Mhm.
Load balancers, all of that stuff that was physical and still is physical for many organizations, but it's also available virtually, where you can get most of that infrastructure um, in the cloud, in like an Azure or an AWS.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's other things that our customers don't think about, right? And so we have a line of business application. And a line of business application may run on a database. And so if we're going to go to the cloud, now do we, and we'll use the most popular one that most people think about is SQL Server, right? Okay. And if you don't know what that is, that's understandable. That's okay. You don't have to. The SQL Server is a database platform that program interfaces with the stored data, right? And then it runs queries for reports and rewrites information, so on and so forth. Well, that's installed on a server on premise, but it doesn't have to be on a server in Azure or Amazon and so on and so forth. Dave, would you kind of explain how that works?
So let's stick with.
I love the smile, by the way, on that one.
We'll stick with SQL Server here because it's very. It's a great example because there's so many different ways that we could deploy something like this. So traditionally, you would have a physical machine sitting in your closet or in your server room, and you would have this program, this SQL Server, program installed on it. And there's a whole lot of other management tools and other softwares that you could use to interface with your databases, run reports against your databases, maybe publish those reports out to the rest of the world, all that good stuff. So now we have the ability to take all that and you can forklift it. You could take that same server and you could create a virtual version of it on, a cloud environment. And it would be that same server where you just have SQL installed on it. And then you have the same management tools installed, the same reporting tools installed, and all that good stuff.
And there's a but here I hear coming. There's a but I hear coming. There's another option.
But that has some drawbacks to it.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to maintain that server. You still have to update that server. You still have to back up that server. You still have to secure that server. You still have to troubleshoot that server when something goes sideways. You still have to make sure that all the little variants and programs that are playing with SQL all play nice in the sandbox. So there's another way that you can do SQL now. You can go on out and in Azure, you can just buy and pay for a virtual Microsoft SQL Server. Okay, what's the difference? Well, you go out and you basically provision the database itself, but you don't manage the actual back end of that SQL Server anymore.
Which is, in this environment, is the Windows operating system, essentially.
So, well, it's the Windows operating system. It's the applications. It's anything that interfaces with it. It's making sure that, any calls that you're making to that database from a third party aren't getting blocked by an internal security measure, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I give an analogy?
Yeah.
I'd love to give an analogy. It's kind of like this guy right here, this voice over IP phone that I have right here, in a sense. I don't manage that voice over IP phone system any longer.
You have a dashboard.
I have a dashboard that I work with.
And you go in and you say on your phone system, when somebody hits this extension, I want it to go to this person. When you're talking about infrastructure as a service, you can go out and say, I want this database to be able to handle this many transactions, and I want it to be accessible by these, at these endpoints. You don't have to worry about how those settings get implemented. You don't have to worry that if Microsoft changes how this database interacts with that particular function, you don't have to worry about that anymore. That is all taken care of behind the
You don't
scenes.
have to patch it.
Correct.
This is one thing I never looked at. Are there storage limits on it? Are there storage quotas on it?
It's all flexible.
Yeah, very much.
But
you don't have to buy the hard drives and manage the hard drives yourself.
Correct. So let's take a good example here. Let's say you have, and I'm just creating a hypothetical. You've got a virtual server running a virtual running an instance of Microsoft SQL server, and you run out of space and you need to expand it. Now, there's a couple different ways you can hit it, but I'm just going to keep this like totally like 101 level. All right. You would have to go out, you'd have to provision an additional hard drive space for that server. You'd then have to mount it. You'd have to modify your database in order to take into account the new, storage space and so on and so forth. Like I said, for anyone out there that's a SQL expert, you're going to just be laughing at that explanation, and I get that. That's okay. But from a technical, from a 101 perspective, there's a lot of steps involved to just increase the amount of space that the database is going to have accessible to it. When you use infrastructure as a service, you can go out and say, "Hey, I just need more space," and you change the number in a modal box on your dashboard, and boom, it's just there.
Done. Just done.
And in addition to that, you actually have the ability in a lot of infrastructure as a service options to allow your resources to increase or decrease to meet particular demand. That's something that you just don't have when you just either have something on premise or you have to manage it yourself. One of the beauties of cloud infrastructure is it can auto scale for you. So if you've got periods of high demand, you can go out and buy a lot more compute resources so that you don't have slowness on whatever it is you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And as soon as that demand is done, it can ratchet things back, and you don't have to continually pay for that ridiculous amount of compute and storage and processing, et cetera, et cetera.
And so let's circle this back around for a minute. Just I don't want to get too far in the weeds. Those are great explanations. So the idea is to try to put together best practices for people, right? And the reason we give this information is to educate so you can start to make appropriate decisions, ask appropriate questions, dive deeper yourself into this. What I would say is one of the best practices at Dave Vinny is as we look at our customers and we help people move to the cloud every day. I think the first best practice is, do you need to, and in regard to servers and infrastructure, should you be setting up servers in the cloud? And so the first question to me isn't what technology do we use. The first question is, do we use that cloud technology, that server or infrastructure in the cloud at all? And what I mean by that, and I have a really good example. I was working with this nonprofit out in Utah, I think. And so that nonprofit said, we run QuickBooks, and we want to move our server to the cloud, and we want to use Windows Virtual Desktops. And we'll talk about Windows Virtual Desktops because I don't think we should have this conversation today without that. And I said, so what else do you want to do on that server? Well, nothing really. Maybe we'll put our documents on that server as a file server. And I said, whoa, wait a second. Let's back up a second and reevaluate this. And I said, if you're just putting a server in the cloud in Azure or Amazon or whoever, right? Why do that? Why not instead go with a web-based version of one of those applications instead of actually running the application in a server? It will be less expensive and still be less for you to deal with overall. Guys, what's your take on that? Vinny, I'm getting a lot of hiss from your microphone, just so you know. Yeah, there we go, much better. And so, guys, what do you say to customers that are considering that? I mean, legal applications, are there cloud-based versions of legal applications to consider instead of installing it on a server in the cloud?
Yeah, so getting a little bit into the application piece, you definitely want to consider. One is, like you said, take it back a step before I even answer that question. You said, should I go to the cloud, right? And the real answer is, or the way to get there is, what's the purpose, right? What's the
Mhm.
reason you wanting to do that, right? And that's one of the factors that help to determine. And then um, is what I'm thinking about correct? Is what you're talking about, right? Is the route that I'm looking at the best option? And you should make a determination, and that sometimes requires uh, potentially switching applications,
Maybe.
right? Sometimes your provider doesn't have a web solution, so there's really no option other than putting the server up in the cloud. But that doesn't mean you have to do that, right? You should consider the options of other providers, even though it's a pain to learn new things. It's a pain to transition and migrate sometimes, and it could be painless, or at least minimal pain, right? But you need to consider those options. You need to consider all the options, because just because it's the same application you've used for the last 10 years or whatever it is, or 20 years, it doesn't mean that that's the right route. There could be better options out there, and there are a lot of applications now that were born on the web. They were born in the cloud. That's what how they were. That's how they were developed from the beginning, and they're going to work a lot smoother than trying to force an application to work in the cloud.
Yeah, I think that I think personally, from my, it's just my personal opinion. Cloud servers are probably, they went up and are were on the increase. And I think with the more of these applications, and we're talking about the business applications, we're not talking about Word, we're talking about billing systems, document systems. I mean, we're talking about CRMs, applications like that that were traditionally on premise. They are either those companies themselves are building complementary cloud applications, or they're not. And unfortunately, I believe that eventually they'll be bought by a cloud company that basically just wants their customers, right? It's people are racing to the cloud, kind of like they did the West, right? It's open territory. There is, there's gold out there, if you will, to be gotten, and that is a new customer that wants to use a cloud service. So now, that's the first question, without a doubt. Should we be continuing to use the applications we're using, or should we look at cloud? Maybe the vendor has a cloud application that we could use and migrate to that, or maybe we should switch vendors altogether. Those are the three, in my opinion. Use the same and put it in the cloud on a server. Buy a complementary cloud application from that same vendor that can be converted, or switch applications altogether. Three very important questions to ask. Now, let's suppose, guys, we are going to stay with that application that's on our server. They don't have a cloud product. We don't want to go through the transition of switching to something else. Some of the solutions out there are Windows Virtual Desktop, terminal servers, or remote desktop servers, right? Can you guys give me a 101 on what Windows Virtual Desktop is and compare it to remote desktop, which I think most people understand?
Okay, so
It's a big one.
We'll try to make it as easy to understand as possible. When you're talking remote desktop, which is what people are traditionally thinking of, again, I think it makes sense to go back to our on-prem analogy. You have a single box sitting in a closet, and everybody remotes into that same box, and we all share resources on it. What this means is, if there's updates to be done, if something goes sideways on that machine, it affects everybody. If somebody's on there using a lot of resources, it could impact everybody. It's what we call session-based. But you're all working off the same set of hardware. In the cloud, you have a similar thing. You can have a terminal, session-based environment where everybody's logging into the same virtual server and working on it, and sharing those resources. The difference between that and as a virtual desktop, again, make the on-premise comparison. Everybody has their own computer that they're working on, and they use their resources, the assets, the memory and the processing power and all that is dedicated to that particular workstation. When you're talking about a cloud version of that, or the virtual desktop, again, it's cloud-based, but everybody has their own isolated set of resources. Now, I'm obviously ignoring the entire idea of pooled resources and drive and WVD pools. I'm keeping it 101. All right. But the idea is that in the cloud, you can either have that virtual terminal server where we all share, or you can have that standalone workspace that each person remotes into. And I should not have even used that phrase, that each person uses to perform their work, but it's their space. Okay. So it's as if it's isolated from the other virtual desktops that are out there. Now, if we went 201, 301, there's a whole lot of nuances to that entire explanation, but that is a basis at its most basic is the virtual desktop is you give everybody their own little cloud-based machine that they work in.
Yep. One other key difference is Windows Terminal Server is a server operating system, and the Windows virtual desktops are Windows 10 operating systems. Right. So a little bit more familiar to the end users, but also a compatibility from an application perspective. Right. There's a lot of at times there's a lot of workarounds we have to do to get applications to work on Terminal Server. Right. And so it simplifies the deployments. You can set up again, getting more into technical stuff on the Windows virtual desktop. You set up a template that says everybody has these applications, right? And you can change that easily. And as the machine comes up, they get the applications, and easy to deploy, easy to maintain. But the operating system is another key difference between the two.
Yeah, I was going to mention that is a big difference. One of the other things that comes to mind for me is cost, right? And so generally speaking, a Windows virtual desktop environment would be less expensive than a terminal server, right? Think of the terminal server is you need a very beefy server to handle all of the users and everything that they're doing, whereas that you can cut back those resources, if you will, on a Windows virtual desktop and have a much better experience.
Not to mention that the fact that each one of your users have different needs as well. You can have a handful of users that are doing much more strenuous activities on their computers, and they could have a lot more resources assigned to their virtual desktops, whereas somebody else who might only work 1 day a week, you could set it up to have that machine on just when they need it, turn it off, and save that cost when they're not at work. So you've got a lot more flexibility in that environment as well.
A terminal server has to be on all the time.
It does. And while you have some scaling options, you're definitely losing some of that flexibility that you have in the WVD environment.
Yeah. Windows Virtual Desktop. There you go. And Vinny, Dave, can you guys maybe tell people if they're going to look at a Windows Virtual Desktop environment, could you maybe tell them do I need a computer? Do I need a laptop to connect to it? Do I need a thin client? What is
that? I can take that, or Vinny, if you want to take that, either one.
Yeah, I mean, all it really requires is the RDP tool, the RDP client on the end user. So there's even a Chromebook, right?
Yeah.
It has an RDP client that you can connect to one of these systems.
And
so even a tablet, like an iPad or an Android tablet, you can download an RDP. So it's a simple device as that, or you can have a laptop or a desktop that can connect to it as well.
And let's end on this, Dave. Would you talk about this concept of published applications isn't anything new, okay?
Not at all.
So can you talk about the published applications concept with WVD?
So here is the best way to think about that. When you log into your computer, you're using Windows 10. That's your operating system. We all know that. And then once we get into Windows 10, we go and we click on QuickBooks, or we click on, our case management system, or we click on whatever. Those are applications. all Windows 10 is doing is allowing us to launch that application. Now, there's a whole lot more going on behind the scenes, but let's not overcomplicate things right now. With a virtual desktop, there are two different ways that you can work with that. You could either use that RDP connection that Vinny was just mentioning and actually remote in to that cloud-based Windows 10 and launch your applications. Or what we can do is we can have the applications themselves run directly on whatever box you're on. So let's say you open up your Chromebook to, make the extreme example here. We
open run Windows programs. Let's
right. You can't even run. It doesn't even. You can't even install Microsoft Word. You can't install QuickBooks application on it. But you've got a button that opens up a panel, and there's Word, Excel, PowerPoint, QuickBooks, your PC Law, whatever it is that you might have. And you double click on that right from your Chromebook. You don't have to remote it anywhere. And guess what? The program just runs, just as if it was installed locally. All it's doing is launching that program from the Windows Virtual Desktop and just basically passing it through to the device that you're on. So it essentially bypasses the need to even interact with this cloud-based environment. It just simply loads the programs that you need to use and makes them accessible. You open it up and it runs just as if you had it installed on a local Windows computer at the office.
And it is absolutely device agnostic. If it can run a web browser and a remote desktop connection, it's device agnostic. So best practice, let's recap then. So first questions first, should we, right? How should we, or should we really? Should we run these applications? Because that's really what we have servers for. The other thing is understanding the nature of, there's a lot of different hosts, a lot of different offerings in a cloud environment, right, guys? There's your servers, there's your hard drives, there's your firewalls. There's so much there, it's unbelievable. Not to mention applications like database applications and more, right? So what should be is the next question. And I think any conversation about cloud now should be virtual desktops, right? So if we're going to build a cloud infrastructure, do we have desktops? And now not only do we eliminate the need for expensive servers, we also eliminate the need for expensive devices to connect to that stuff, right? And we start to potentially run inexpensive ones. So guys, I think we've got a few best practices we got out here. These are the things that we think about when we're trying to help a customer make the best decision possible for moving to the cloud. So guys, let's see, next week we're going to talk about emails and documents, which I think we were supposed to talk about this week. We flip-flopped on you, so sorry about that, audience. But next week we're going to talk about email migration and document migration, and the gotchas with that, and the things that you should do to prepare best for a migration into a cloud service for emails and documents. So next Tuesday, 10:30 Eastern. If you are not a member of our group on LinkedIn, please, by all means, go find our No Law Firm Left Behind group on LinkedIn. Take a real quick picture of that with your phone. And I'm not even bothered with the QR code. But on this link, we publish all of our, I'll actually show the QR code, publish all of our videos weekly. So it's an easy place to find all that stuff. In addition, Dave, you love the QR code.
Hey, it's, good stuff.
The QR code will take you to a landing page that has a link to all of we turn these into podcasts, to turn them on all your favorite podcast platforms, whether it be Pandora, iHeartRadio, and so on and so forth. So take a picture of that. This video is available. If you have any questions after the session, put them in here. We're happy to comment on them. So thanks a lot, guys. Great topic.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.